Intra-history remembers crowns, parades, and portraits. But behind them once stood a young girl, frightened yet unshaken, staring into the storm of war. In 1939, when the world caught fire, Princess Elizabeth wasn't just waiting for her throne. She was preparing to serve her country. This is the story of how a princess traded silk gloves for grease-stained hands, how duty, sacrifice, and courage forged the woman who would become the most enduring monarch of our time. This is Blood, Oil and Honour, the princess who served Britain. If you've ever admired Queen Elizabeth, not just as a ruler, but as a woman of courage, then this story will touch your heart. But before we begin, if you believe her legacy deserves to be remembered with honour, then take a second to subscribe. Because here, we tell the stories the world forgets with the respect they truly deserve. The dawn of war and a princess in waiting. Before she was the world's longest reigning monarch, she was simply Lilibet, a quiet, disciplined young girl growing up within the polished halls of Buckingham Palace. Born into privilege, yes, but raised with purpose. From her earliest years, Elizabeth Alexandra Mary Windsor was taught that duty was not an option, it was destiny. The 1,930 seconds were a time of calm before the storm. The royal gardens bloomed, the air was filled with music and laughter, yet far beyond the palace gates. The winds of war were gathering over Europe. Britain was uneasy, families prepared, soldiers trained, and in the distance, the thunder of conflict drew closer. When the announcement came on September 3rd, 1939, it shattered the peace of royal childhood. Britain was at war with Germany. The radio broadcast echoed through the palace halls as King George VI addressed his nation with trembling resolve. And standing quietly beside her mother, Princess Elizabeth listened, realizing that the world she knew had changed forever. At just 13, she was too young to serve, too young to fight, but not too young to understand fear. The palace windows were blacked out, air raid sirens screamed through the London night, and rationing began even for the royals. Yet, instead of despair, her parents chose courage. "The children will not go without me," the Queen Mother declared, "and I will not leave the king." That single decision defined the future Queen's spirit. She would not be a monarch made by comfort, but by courage. A child of duty, growing up under the shadow of war, ready to serve before she ever ruled. Because even before she wore a crown, Elizabeth had already chosen service. Britain under siege, the crown under threat. By 1940, the storm had reached Britain's shores. The German Luftwaffe darkened the skies, and London, once a symbol of calm and empire, became a city of smoke and fire. The Blitz had begun. Night after night, bombs rained over rooftops, churches crumbled, and the people of Britain huddled underground as their world burned above them. Inside Buckingham Palace, even royalty could not escape the terror. One morning, a bomb exploded just yards from the royal chapel. Windows shattered, walls trembled, and yet King George VI and Queen Elizabeth refused to flee. "The children will not go without us," the Queen Mother said again. "I will not leave the king." Their defiance became the nation's heartbeat. Young Princess Elizabeth and her sister Margaret were evacuated to Windsor Castle for safety. But even there, the fear was real. The nights were long, the sirens endless. Elizabeth spent hours in the dim light of underground shelters, listening to distant explosions. She learned early that a leader's strength was not in luxury but in resilience. Every letter she wrote, every broadcast she listened to, connected her to the millions suffering outside the castle walls. She knew her people were fighting not only for their homes, but for their hope. And she wanted desperately to do her part. Britain was bleeding, but its spirit refused to die. And in that fire, something remarkable was born, the steel within a young princess who would one day hold her country together with that same unshakable will. Before she ever wore a crown, Elizabeth learned what it meant to stand firm when everything around her fell. The Princess of Courage, Elizabeth joins the war effort. By 1944, the thunder of war had grown distant, but the call of duty grew louder in Elizabeth's heart. She was no longer the little girl hiding beneath castle walls. She was 18, determined, and ready to serve her country, not as a royal, but as a soldier. Against centuries of royal precedent, she made a bold request. She wanted to enlist. The idea shocked the courtiers and unsettled even the king. But Elizabeth stood firm. She didn't want to simply watch history, she wanted to earn her place in it. And so, the heir to the British throne joined the Auxiliary Territorial Service, becoming second subaltern Elizabeth Windsor. Dressed in khaki, with grease-stained hands and rolled-up sleeves, she learned to drive and repair army trucks. Gone were the silks and jewels. In their place stood a young woman covered in engine oil and resolve. Fellow trainees recalled how she refused special treatment. She waited her turn for rations, polished her boots, and shared jokes with the other girls in the barracks. The image of a future queen, fixing engines under the dim light of a hangar, captured the world's imagination. For the British people, she was no longer just a princess, she was one of them. When she returned to Buckingham Palace after her training, her father, King George VI, looked at her not just with pride, but with recognition. His daughter had become a reflection of everything Britain stood for: endurance, humility, and quiet strength. In those months of service, Princess Elizabeth didn't just prepare for the throne, she forged the heart of a queen who would one day guide her nation through even darker storms. VE Day, the night the princess walked among the people. May 8th, 1945. The war was finally over. The streets of London erupted with joy, songs and tears as the words "Victory in Europe" echoed through radios and church bells alike. The air was thick with relief, and for the first time in 6 long years, laughter filled the night sky. Inside Buckingham Palace, the royal family stood at the balcony, waving to the sea of people below. Yet behind the smile of Princess Elizabeth burned a single wish to be among them, not above them. She had worked, served, and grown beside her people through war. Now she longed to celebrate beside them. With her sister Margaret at her side, Elizabeth made a daring request to her parents, permission to leave the palace incognito. After hesitation and a promise to remain discreet, the king agreed. That night, the two princesses slipped into the crowd, blending with thousands of Londoners, their faces lit by the glow of bonfires and neon lights. No one recognized them. For the first time, Elizabeth wasn't the heir to the throne. She was simply a young woman, laughing, singing, and joining conga lines down Piccadilly. She danced with soldiers, spoke with strangers, and shared in the pure, unfiltered joy of freedom. Years later, she would recall that night as one of the most extraordinary experiences of her life. For just a few hours, she felt the pulse of her nation, its resilience, its unity, its heart beating in rhythm with her own. That night, the princess didn't just celebrate victory. She became the spirit of Britain, human, hopeful, and forever bound to her people. The making of a monarch, lessons from war. When the guns fell silent and the smoke of war began to fade, Britain stood scarred yet unbroken, and so did its young princess. The Second World War had shaped Elizabeth, Windsor, in ways no royal tutor ever could. Beneath the crown she would one day wear, the steel of service had already been forged. From the long nights in air raid shelters to the grease-stained days repairing army trucks, the war had taught her 3 lessons she would carry all her life: duty, discipline, and empathy. She had seen suffering not from the comfort of the throne, but through the eyes of soldiers, nurses, and mothers who had lost everything. It was a rare education, the kind only hardship can give. When she spoke to factory workers or war widows in the years that followed, her words carried quiet authority. People listened, not because she was a princess, but because she understood. She had lived through the same fear, breathed the same dust, and shared the same hope that tomorrow would be better. Her father, King George VI, noticed the change too. He saw in Elizabeth a calm strength, a steadiness that mirrored the very resilience of Britain itself. Though there was still young, he began to prepare her more deliberately for the throne. The crown was no longer a distant destiny. It was a weight she had already begun to bear. The war had taken millions of lives. but it had also given the world a leader shaped by compassion rather than privilege. The girl who once saluted soldiers from a balcony was now ready to stand among them, a monarch forged not in gold, but in grit. From princess to queen, the burden of peace. The end of the war brought peace, but peace, as Elizabeth soon learned, carried its own kind of burden. Britain was rebuilding, mourning, and redefining itself. The empire her ancestors once ruled was fading, and a new, uncertain world was rising from the rubble. Princess Elizabeth stepped into this fragile dawn not as a child of privilege, but as a woman shaped by service. She had seen what unity could accomplish in the darkest days, and she believed that same spirit could rebuild a wounded nation. Her visits to hospitals, factories, and schools weren't ceremonial, they were personal missions. Every handshake, every word of comfort, every quiet smile was her way of reminding her people that the crown still stood with them, not above them. Then, in 1952, tragedy arrived quietly. King George VI, her beloved father, passed away. The telegram reached her while she was in Kenya, and by the time she returned to London, she was no longer a princess. The world now called her Queen Elizabeth II. At just 25 years old, she wore the weight of centuries upon her shoulders. Yet those who saw her on that solemn day said her composure was remarkable, calm, poised, almost unearthly. But inside, she was grieving the man who had been her greatest teacher, the father who had shown her how to lead with humility. As she stepped forward into her destiny, the lessons of war guided her still. She had witnessed destruction. Now she would dedicate her life to preservation. She had learned duty in chaos. Now she would embody it in peace. The princess who once fixed army trucks now carried the world, and she did it with the same quiet hands that had once served Britain in its darkest hour. Legacy of steel and grace. History often remembers kings for their wars, but Queen Elizabeth II was remembered for her peace, a peace forged in the fire of conflict. Her legacy was not one of conquest, but of constancy. She had lived through air raids, ration lines, and blackouts, yet emerged with a calm that seemed unshakable. That calm became her crown. For those who served under her reign, she was more than a monarch. She was a reminder that endurance is its own kind of victory. Every Christmas broadcast carried echoes of the war years, messages of hope, of unity, of holding on through hardship. She never spoke of herself as a heroine, but to her people, she had become one. Decades later, as she stood on the balcony of Buckingham Palace during her Platinum Jubilee, the world saw not just a queen but the same young woman who once rolled up her sleeves in a mechanic's uniform, defying expectations, proving that royalty could serve, not just rule. Her grace was not fragile, it was forged. Her composure was not inherited, it was earned. And as Britain changed through wars, recessions, and revolutions of culture, she remained the one unbroken thread. To the very end, she carried within her the heartbeat of that wartime girl, the one who had learned to find courage in silence and dignity in duty. When the bells tolled for her in 2022, millions wept not for a queen alone, but for the era she represented. The engines of war had once tested her spirit. The years that followed proved it unbreakable. She was, in every sense, the daughter of war and the mother of peace. Outro. The last light of the empire. As the sun set on the reign of Queen Elizabeth II, it wasn't just a monarch the world was mourning. It was the fading light of an age that believed in duty above desire, service above self. From the wreckage of World War II to the dawn of the digital era, she stood like a pillar between worlds, the last bridge from empire to modernity, from silence to spectacle. And through it all, she carried herself with that same quiet dignity she'd learned as a girl under the sound of air raid sirens. The hands that once held a wrench in an army garage would later hold the weight of a crown. And yet, she bore both with the same unshaken grace. Her story reminds us that greatness is not built in palaces, but in perseverance. That real strength is not in command, but in composure. And that sometimes, the truest mark of royalty is the courage to serve when the world expects you to reign. She was not born to be a symbol of survival, but she became one. And when history turns its pages, Her name will forever stand, not only as Elizabeth the Queen, but Elizabeth the Steadfast.